The heart monitor didn't beep. It screamed. Then it went silent. At Mercyvale General Hospital in Denton, Montana, the night shift was already short 3 nurses when the cardiac patient in room 14 stopped breathing. The new infusion pump, the cheap one administration had installed 2 weeks ago, sat dark and useless on its stand. No alarm, no warning, nothing. Down the hall, a quiet woman in worn scrubs was already moving before anyone called her name. Her name was Nora Hallis. Nobody knew what she'd done before she became a night shift nurse. Nobody knew what she was capable of. They were about to find out. If this story pulls you in, stay with me all the way to the end. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The overnight bus from Billings dropped Nora Hallis at the corner of Callaway and 5th at 20 past 11 on a Tuesday, and she stood there for a moment with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a paper cup of gas station coffee going cold in her hand, looking up at Mercyvale General like it was a place she was trying to talk herself into. The hospital wasn't impressive. 4 stories of beige concrete with a parking lot that hadn't been repaved in years. 2 of the exterior lights flickering against the October dark. The kind of building that had probably been modern once, 30 years ago, and had been held together since then by maintenance budgets and wishful thinking. Nora took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like hot cardboard. She crossed the parking lot anyway. The HR office had emailed her contract 3 days prior, 2 days after she'd submitted her application. The speed of it should have been a signal. Mercyvale was short-staffed in ways that didn't fully show up on paper. She'd noticed that in the job listing, in the way the posting had been up for months, in the fact that they'd hired her without an in-person interview. Nursing positions didn't fill that fast unless something was making people leave. She'd taken the job anyway because Denton was small and quiet, and 3 states away from the last place she'd worked, and small and quiet and far away were exactly what she needed right now. The night shift charge nurse was a woman named Bev Okafor, late 40s, with the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing this long enough that every gesture served a purpose. She shook Nora's hand at the nurse's station, looked her over once, and handed her a badge without a lot of ceremony. "You've got 6 patients on the West Wing," Bev said. "Rooms 9 through 14, cardiac recovery, post-op, 1 palliative. Your med schedule's in the system. We're running thin tonight, Bikem," Priya called out, "so you're covering her too as well." She said it matter-of-factly, not complaining, just laying out facts the way you lay out a map. "Okay," Nora said. Bev looked at her. "You sure? That's 8 patients. Some nurses want to negotiate." I said okay. Something in Bev's face shifted slightly. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. "Rounds start in 10 minutes. Crash cart's at the end of the hall. We only have 1 crash cart for the whole floor right now, so if you need it fast, you shout." Nora didn't ask why there was only 1 crash cart. She was already reading the rest of the floor. The way the supply cabinet was padlocked with a combination lock instead of a key card, the sticky notes someone had taped to the side of the medication dispensary with handwritten instructions because apparently the screen interface was broken, the stack of incident report forms on the counter that looked like they'd been accumulating for weeks. Small things. The kind of small things that added up to a larger picture. She picked up the first patient chart and started reading. The man in room 14 was named Gerald Foss, 67 years old, admitted 4 days ago following an anterior wall myocardial infarction, a heart attack serious enough that he'd been airlifted from a smaller clinic in Havre. He was recovering, according to the chart, but recovering slowly, and the notes from the previous shift mentioned that his blood pressure had been running inconsistently. He was also connected to one of the new infusion pumps. Nora stood in the doorway of room 14 for a moment, looking at the pump without going in, the way you look at something that's bothering you before you've figured out exactly why. It was a BD90 series. She'd seen the brand before, recognized it immediately, because there had been a quiet advisory notice circulated about 18 months ago flagging certain firmware versions as prone to silent failure under specific load conditions. Not a full recall, just an advisory. She went in and checked the connections, checked the settings, checked the backup battery indicator. Everything read normal. She made a note in her head anyway, the same way you make note of a car that's running fine, but making a sound you don't quite trust. The rest of the first hour passed in the ordinary controlled chaos of an understaffed hospital night shift. Blood draws, medication passes, a patient in room 10 who'd pulled out his IV in his sleep and needed a new line, a family member who'd snuck past the visitor restriction and was asleep in the chair in room 12 and needed to be gently redirected. Nora moved through it all with the flat efficiency of someone who'd worked in environments where the cost of hesitation was measured in seconds. Bev watched her, not obviously, but Nora noticed. Nurses always watched the new person. It was instinct, not suspicion. You needed to know fast whether the person standing next to you was someone you could count on when things went wrong. Around 1 a.m., they had a few minutes at the nurses' station at the same time, and Bev refilled her coffee and said without looking at Nora, "Where were you before this?" "Montana Regional, down in Missoula. Before that, I was traveling." "Travel nursing?" "Something like that." Bev looked at her then. "You've got a way of moving. Like you've worked trauma." It wasn't quite a question. "Some," Nora said, and left it there, and Bev had the professional tact not to push. What Nora didn't say: the 7 years before nursing school. The deployments? The FOB in a country she still couldn't discuss under her clearance terms, where she'd worked as a combat medic attached to a special operations unit, running trauma care in conditions that made every ER she'd ever worked in look generously equipped. The things she'd improvised out of necessity, the people she'd lost, the people she hadn't. She didn't say any of that. She just picked up her next chart and kept moving. The name that started appearing in conversation by the end of her first week was Marcus Holt. She heard it before she saw him. The way staff mentioned him, careful, a half-second pause before the name, the kind of pause people use when they're deciding how much to say, told her most of what she needed to know about the atmosphere before she ever set foot in his presence. Marcus Holt was the CEO of Mercyvale General and had been for the past 3 years. 49, Harvard Business School, came from a background in healthcare consulting rather than medicine. His management style, as best as Nora could piece together from what people said and didn't say, could be summarized as cut what you can, charge what you can, and measure success in quarterly margins. She saw him for the first time at the Thursday morning shift crossover when she was finishing a 12-hour night and he was doing what apparently passed for a floor walk. He was tall, well-dressed in the way that read as effortful, with the kind of smile that was calibrated specifically for the moment you were looking at him. He stopped at the nurse's station and said, to no one in particular, "Good team this morning, efficient." Nobody responded with any real warmth. There was a murmur, a few nods, the kind of politeness that's more about avoiding consequences than expressing agreement. Holt's eyes moved around the floor and landed on Nora for a moment. "New face." "Started Monday," she said. "How are we doing?" She looked at him evenly. "We're managing." The word she'd chosen was deliberate, and she could see from the slight shift in his expression that he'd registered it. Managing was not the same as thriving. Managing was not the same as well-staffed and well-equipped. Managing said, "We are keeping our heads above water, and you should be asking why." But Holt just smiled again, made a note on his tablet, and moved on. She watched him go and thought, he's not oblivious. He knows exactly what's happening on this floor. He just doesn't think it's a problem. By her second week, she had a clearer picture. The hospital had been running at 70% nursing capacity for 4 months. 2 full-time positions unfilled, 1 nurse on extended medical leave, and the administration's response had been to redistribute the caseloads and book the overtime line on the budget as a temporary measure, temporary being a word that apparently meant indefinite. The equipment situation was worse. In the past 6 months, Mercyvale had quietly replaced a number of critical care devices with a brand she hadn't encountered before: Caravant Medical Systems. The pumps, 2 of the ventilators, the telemetry units in cardiac recovery. The Caravant gear looked modern, the interfaces were clean, and on the surface they performed fine. But nurses talked, and what they talked about when they talked about Caravant was that the equipment had a habit of running quietly fine, right up until it didn't. The pump in room 11 lost its alarm functionality for about 40 minutes 2 weeks ago, said a day shift nurse named Dan Riker, on a Wednesday when they were both in the break room at the same time. He said it the way people say things they've given up reporting. Just stopped alerting. Patient was fine, but... Did it get documented? He looked at her. I filed the report. And? He smiled, but it didn't reach anywhere. It got reviewed. Manufacturer was contacted. Caravant sent an email saying there was a known firmware issue that had been patched. He picked up his coffee. Same pump is still in that room. Nora said nothing for a moment. Then, who approved the Caravant contract? Dan shrugged. Administration. Holt? I'd assume. But those decisions don't exactly come with a signature we get to see. She thought about Gerald Foss's pump, about the BD90 advisory notice, about the way Holt had made his note on his tablet and moved on. She went back to her floor and started paying very careful attention. The crash happened on a Saturday night in Nora's third week, at 2:17 a.m., in the middle of a storm that had knocked out half the parking lot lighting and was rattling the windows at the end of the hall with a sound like something trying to get in. She was in room 10 finishing a chart note when the telemetry alert she'd been halfway expecting for 11 days finally went off. Except it wasn't the pump alarm, because the pump alarm didn't go off. What went off was the heart monitor, Gerald Foss's cardiac rhythms suddenly throwing up PVCs on the display at the nurse's station. Irregular and worsening, and then the monitor alarm cut out too. The monitor alarm cut out because the telemetry unit had dropped its connection. In another hospital, a properly staffed unit with functioning backup systems, the next layer of alerts would have kicked in. But the backup alert system that should have registered the dropout was a piece of Caravant hardware, and it didn't register anything. What happened instead was that Dan, who happened to be pulling an extra shift and happened to glance at the monitoring screen at the exact right second, shouted down the hall, and Nora was already moving before she consciously registered the words. She came through the door of room 14 and took in the scene in the space of 2 seconds. Gerald Foss, pale, diaphoretic, his breathing labored and wrong. The infusion pump showing a code she didn't recognize on its screen. The drip stopped. The cardiac monitor cycling through an error reset. A young nurse named Caitlin standing at the foot of the bed, frozen, looking at the pump like she could fix it by understanding it hard enough. Caitlin, leave the pump. Get me a manual BP cuff, the crash cart from the hall, and find me a 60 cubic centimeter syringe. Nora's voice was flat and completely calm, the calm of someone who'd stopped the part of their brain that panics because it wasn't useful. Now, move. Caitlin moved. Nora was already at Gerald's side, her fingers on his wrist, counting, her other hand on his sternum, feeling the quality of his effort to breathe. His pulse was there, but wrong. Too fast and irregular, the unmistakable signature of a rhythm trying to organize itself into something dangerous. The pump was locked. The interface was cycling, showing an error code she later identified as a firmware conflict, the kind of silent catastrophic failure that should have triggered an alarm and didn't, because the alarm logic was part of the same firmware that had failed. She reached behind the pump and found the manual flow clamp on the line, the analog backup that existed specifically for this moment, and adjusted the drip rate by hand. Not ideal, not precise, but the difference between something and nothing. Dan arrived with the crash cart. Caitlin came back with the BP cuff. Nora was already talking to Gerald, not because she needed him to respond, but because conscious patients did better when someone was talking to them, when they had a voice to orient to. Gerald, I'm Nora. I'm your nurse. You're okay. Stay with me. Just breathe with me. He couldn't really answer, but his eyes found her face and stayed there. She worked fast and without drama, the way she'd been trained in circumstances where drama cost you seconds you didn't have. Manual BP. 90/58. Not good, but not catastrophically bad. Rhythm on the portable cardiac monitor from the crash cart. VTAC. Sustained. The thing she'd been afraid of. She made the call fast, pulled the lidocaine from the crash kit, drew the dose, confirmed with Dan, administered it, and then stood at the side of the bed with her fingers on Gerald's wrist and waited. Come on, she said quietly. Not to anyone, just into the air. 30 seconds. His pulse changed under her fingers, slowed, steadied, reorganized itself into something that felt like a heartbeat instead of an electrical argument. She let out a breath through her nose. Get me Dr. Vasquez on the phone right now, she said to Dan, and I need someone to pull that pump off the line and tag it. Don't let anyone reset it. The error stayed as evidence. Dan looked at her for a second. Evidence of what? That the alarm didn't work, she said. Tag it. Dr. Vasquez arrived 12 minutes later. Gerald Foss was stable. The pump was tagged and sitting in the corner with Caitlin standing next to it, because Nora had asked her to stay with it, and Caitlin, for all her earlier freezing, had the good instincts to understand that this was important. Vasquez ran his own assessment, confirmed the stabilization, ordered a transfer to the cardiac ICU on the floor above, and then looked at Nora. That was fast thinking. The pump failed silently, she said. No alarm. The telemetry unit dropped connection, and the backup didn't catch it. Vasquez's face did something complicated. I'll write it up. There are at least 3 more Caravan pumps on this floor, Nora said, and one of them already had a documented firmware failure 2 weeks ago. It wasn't replaced. Vasquez looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the tagged pump in the corner. Then he picked up his phone. She watched him walk out into the hall and knew that what happened next depended entirely on what he did with the call he was about to make. She found out 3 days later. He'd reported it to the director of nursing, a woman named Sandra Priest, who had reported it up the chain to Holt's office. Holt's office had responded by scheduling a review meeting. The review meeting was on a Tuesday morning, and Nora was invited, which in retrospect should have told her something. The conference room on the administrative floor smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee, and the particular anxiety of people who were about to spend an hour managing a situation instead of solving one. Holt was there, along with Priest, a man from the legal department named Wheeler, and a woman Nora didn't know who turned out to be Mercyvale's risk management director. Nora sat across the table from all of them and put her hands flat on the table and waited. Holt opened. We appreciate you coming in. We wanted to follow up on the incident in room 14 and make sure we have a complete picture. The pump failed, Nora said. No alarm. The patient went into sustained VTAC. I intervened manually, and we're grateful for that intervention. Holt's voice was warm and smooth and completely disconnected from anything real. What we want to understand is whether there was a protocol issue, whether the floor was following proper monitoring procedures that night. She looked at him. The monitoring equipment failed. The pump experienced a software exception, Wheeler said, reading from something. The manufacturer has confirmed this is a known issue with a patch available. The same manufacturer told you that 2 weeks ago about a different pump, Nora said. That pump is still on the floor. A silence. These procurement decisions involve complex... Wheeler started. A man almost died because an alarm didn't work, Nora said. That's the sentence we're working with here, not procurement complexity. Holt leaned back slightly. The warmth in his voice didn't change, but something behind it shifted. Nurse Hallis, we're trying to conduct a thorough review. I'd ask you to trust that process. I'd trust the process more if the equipment that failed had been removed from the floor pending review, she said. It hasn't been. Priest cleared her throat. We're working on a timeline for... I've documented everything, Nora said. The incident, the previous report that was filed and not acted on, the pump serial numbers, the firmware versions. I have copies. The room went very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that told her she'd changed something. She'd walked in as a new nurse with a complaint about equipment. She'd just become something else, something that required a different kind of management. Holt looked at her. The warmth was still there. But underneath it now, she could see him recalibrating. I think we have what we need for now, he said pleasantly. We'll follow up with you. She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. In the elevator going down to the parking level, she thought about what she'd copied before she came to this meeting. Incident reports, pump serial numbers, shift logs, the email chain from Caravant's response to Dan's original report. She'd sent copies to her personal email from a personal device, not hospital systems, her own. She'd learned a long time ago, in conditions significantly more dangerous than a corporate conference room, that the moment you raise something in front of people who have reasons to make it disappear, you make sure you have a copy that can't disappear with it. Well, Thursday, 2 days later, she was called back to administration. Not for a follow-up meeting, for an exit interview. She sat in Sandra Priest's office and was told, with a great deal of regret and language about restructuring, that her position was being eliminated as part of a staffing optimization effort. She'd received 2 weeks of severance. Her final shift would be that night. Staffing optimization, Nora repeated. I know this isn't what you were hoping to hear, Price said. Nora looked at her. Not with anger, not exactly. More with the specific tiredness of someone who'd known this was coming and had already decided what to do about it. 3 nurses left in the last 2 months, she said. You hired me to cover the gap. Now you're eliminating the position. Priest didn't answer. How many incidents like room 14 happened before I got here? Nora asked. Priest's face went very still. Right, Nora said and stood up. She worked her last shift that night, all 8 patients, all 12 hours, because she wasn't going to leave her patients short-handed regardless of what Holt and his lawyers had decided. She did her rounds with the same flat efficiency she'd brought on night 1, and when she handed off to the morning shift at 7 a.m., she gave Bev the most thorough verbal report she'd ever given anyone. Bev stood at the nurse's station listening to it with an expression that was somewhere between professional attention and something raw, and when Nora finished, Bev said very quietly, "Where are you going to go?" "I need to make a few calls first," Nora said. She collected her things, turned in her badge at the front desk, and walked out through the automatic doors into a gray Montana morning. The parking lot was wet from overnight rain. She stood next to her car for a moment, phone in hand. The documentation she'd copied was sitting in her email drafts, not yet sent to anyone. She'd wanted to exhaust the internal process first, wanted to be sure she wasn't misreading the situation, wanted to give Mercy Vale the chance to be better than she suspected it was going to be. Now she knew. She opened her phone's contacts and scrolled to a name she hadn't dialed in almost 2 years, a woman she'd known in a different life, in a context she didn't talk about, who now worked at the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. The line rang twice. "Donnelly," the woman answered. "It's Nora Hallis," she said. "I need to report a patient safety situation, and I think there's something larger underneath it." A pause on the other end. Not hesitation, recognition. "Tell me," Donnelly said. Nora looked back at the hospital, at its beige concrete and flickering lights, at the 4 floors of people inside it who were depending on equipment that might fail silently in the middle of the night. She started talking. Donnelly didn't say much while Nora talked. That was one of the things Nora remembered about her. She listened the way people listened when they were actually building something in their head, not just waiting for a gap to speak into. The line had some static from the storm remnants still moving through the region, and Nora stood in the wet parking lot until her feet were cold, laying it out in the order it had happened. The Caravan equipment, the firmware failure, the previous report that went nowhere, Gerald Foss, the meeting with Holt and Wheeler, the exit interview 2 days later. When she finished, Donnelly was quiet for a moment. "You still have copies of everything you described?" "Yes." "Physical or digital?" "Digital. Personal email, personal device. Nothing that runs through the hospital system." Another pause. "Okay. Don't send anything yet. Don't post anything. Don't contact the manufacturer. Don't talk to the press. I need to make a call and see where this lands jurisdictionally. There may be CMS involvement depending on how the procurement piece shakes out." "The procurement piece," Nora said. "You said you think there's something larger underneath it. What specifically makes you think that?" Nora watched a crow land on the wet pavement 6 feet away, consider her, and decide she wasn't interesting enough to bother with. The Caravan contract replaced equipment that wasn't at end of life. The old pumps were replaced early. I've seen that before. In hospital procurement, it sometimes means the new vendor offered something the old vendor didn't. A better price, or a better relationship with the person doing the approving. Donnelly's end of the line was quiet in a focused way. "Sit on this for now. Don't disappear. I may need you in the next few weeks." "I'm not going anywhere," Nora said, which wasn't entirely true, but was true enough for the purposes of this conversation. She got in the car and drove to the motel on the east side of Denton, where she'd been staying since she arrived. She hadn't signed a lease, hadn't wanted to commit to anything until she understood the situation better, which had turned out to be a reasonable instinct. The room was small and smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, and the heater made a noise like someone tapping a radiator with a spoon at irregular intervals. But it was functional, and functional was what she needed right now. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her laptop and started building a proper record. Not the scattered notes she'd made on her phone during shifts, but an organized document with dates, times, incident numbers, serial numbers, the full timeline laid out in the kind of sequential detail that left no room for interpretation. She'd done this before, in different contexts with different stakes, and the muscle memory of it was oddly steadying. Outside, Denton went about its Thursday morning. Inside, Nora Hallis began to make a file. 3 days passed without contact from Donnelly, which meant either nothing had happened yet or something had happened that Donnelly wasn't ready to tell her about. Nora had learned to tell the difference between silence as delay and silence as movement, and this felt like the latter, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. She used the time practically. She drove past the hospital twice, not stopping, not getting close enough to make anyone notice. And on the second pass, she saw that the main entrance had new signage on the door, something about visiting hours, which meant someone had updated the exterior materials recently, which was the kind of thing hospitals did when they were trying to manage a public image. Possibly unrelated. Possibly not. She also, on an impulse she didn't entirely analyze, drove to the county clerk's office and spent 40 minutes looking at public records. Business filings, mostly. Caravant Medical Systems was incorporated in Delaware. Standard, that meant nothing. But the registered agent in Montana was a holding company called Rimrock Capital Partners. And Rimrock Capital Partners had an address that matched a private equity firm in Billings that had been involved in 2 hospital acquisitions in the state over the past 6 years. She wrote down the name and the address and drove back to the motel. That evening her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize, Montana area code. She answered. Ms. Hallis. A man's voice, careful and measured, the kind of careful that came from professional training rather than natural temperament. My name is Agent Roy Fetters. I'm with the HHS Office of Inspector General Field Office out of Denver. I understand you spoke with a colleague of mine earlier this week. I did. I'd like to meet with you in person if that's possible. There are some follow-up questions I need to ask, and some things I'd like to share with you about the context of your situation. Something about the phrase your situation registered as slightly off. Not threatening, more like he was being precise about something he wasn't ready to name directly yet. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, if you're available. There's a diner on Callaway called Marta's, 9 o'clock. She knew the diner. She'd gotten breakfast there twice, both times sitting in the corner booth because she liked to be able to see the door. I'll be there, she said. Shit. Fetters was already at a table when she arrived. Not her corner booth, but a table against the side wall that she grudgingly admitted was actually better for a private conversation because the ambient noise from the kitchen masked voices. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, wearing a jacket that was trying to look casual and failing in a way that said federal employee more clearly than a badge would have. There was a woman with him he introduced as Agent Carla Mehta, younger, laptop bag over her shoulder. Coffee arrived. Nobody touched it immediately. Before we get into specifics, Fetters said, I want to be clear that you are not the subject of any investigation. You are a potential witness and a whistleblower, and the protections applicable to that status are real and they apply to you. Okay, Nora said, tell me about the context of my situation. Fetters looked at Mehta briefly, something passing between them, and Mehta opened a folder and put 2 documents on the table. Not facing outward, she slid them across so only Nora could read them. The first was a partial list of Caravant Medical Systems contracts in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. 7 hospitals. 3 of them had logged equipment incidents with CMS in the past 18 months. The second was a summary, heavily redacted but readable in outline, of an existing procurement fraud inquiry that had been open for 8 months. Nora looked at both of them for a moment without speaking. Mercyvale isn't the only hospital, she said. No, Fetters said. It is not. How many patients? Incidents, not necessarily patients. He said it carefully, the distinction between the category and the consequence. Documented equipment failures with potential patient impact across the 7 sites. Mercyvale's situation, specifically your Room 14 incident, is significant because it's the first one with a clinical intervention on record that prevented a documented adverse outcome. Meaning, I'm the first one who wrote it down properly. Meaning, you're the first one who had both the clinical skills to intervene and the documentation practice to create a paper trail that's usable. Nora looked at the redacted summary again. 8 months. The investigation had been running for 8 months. Someone had been building this before she ever walked into Mercyvale General. What do you need from me? She said. Your documentation to start. The incident records, the pump serial numbers, the email chain you described. And we'd like a formal deposition at some point. That timeline is flexible. Fetters picked up his coffee for the first time. There's one more thing. She waited, Marcus Holt has a financial relationship with Rimrock Capital Partners. It's structured through a family trust, which is why it doesn't appear in standard hospital board disclosures. We've known about it for 6 months. What we haven't been able to establish is direct communication between Holt and Caravant at the time of the contract decision. He set down the coffee. Your employment was terminated 2 days after you raised equipment safety concerns in an administrative meeting. That's a potential retaliation pattern. It's also a behavioral signal. It suggests Holt has reason to believe the contract situation is a vulnerability. Nora sat with that for a moment. You want me to stay visible. We want you to proceed normally. If Holt or anyone connected to him makes contact, we want to know immediately. We're not asking you to do anything active, just don't disappear. She thought about what Donnelly had said on the phone. Sit on this. Don't disappear. You already told me that through Donnelly, she said. Fetter's expression didn't change, but something in it acknowledged the observation. We wanted to make sure the instructions still made sense now that you have more context. She picked up her own coffee and finally drank some. It was better than the gas station variety. I have a question that isn't about the investigation. Go ahead. The 3 other hospitals where incidents were logged, are the Caravant pumps still in service? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. That's a CMS compliance question, Mehta said, which is separate from the OIG criminal inquiry. People are in those hospitals right now, Nora said, connected to equipment that's already failed in 7 locations. I understand that, Fetter said. Do you have a timeline? We're moving as fast as we can move. She looked at him. That's not a timeline. He held her gaze. No, it isn't. He said it without apology, which she respected more than reassurance would have been. What I can tell you is that the CMS side is aware and is conducting parallel action. These things are moving simultaneously, not sequentially. Nora nodded once and put down her coffee cup. She drove back to the motel and sat on the bed and stared at the wall for about 4 minutes, which was longer than she usually let herself do that kind of thing. And then she opened her laptop and kept building the file. The call from Bev came 11 days after Nora's last shift, at 6 p.m. on a Sunday, and Bev's voice on the line had the particular texture of someone who was choosing words carefully in a situation where she wasn't sure who might be listening. I'm calling to check in, Bev said. Personally, not officially. I appreciate that, Nora said. How are things on the floor? A pause. Busy, which meant something. Busy on a Sunday evening on the cardiac recovery floor meant census was up, which meant something was driving admissions, which in a hospital running on inadequate staffing meant the pressure on the remaining nurses was increasing. Bev, Nora said carefully, is there something specific you're calling about? Another pause. Longer. There was another incident. Thursday night. Room 9. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Same equipment? Different pump, same brand. The night shift caught it early. The alarm ran late, about 6 minutes. Patient was okay, but... Bev stopped. It was written up? Yes. And then the director of nursing had a meeting with the floor staff Friday morning. Bev's voice went flatter. She told us the incident had been reviewed and the equipment had been cleared for continued use pending a firmware update from the manufacturer. They're not pulling them. No. Is the update scheduled? The manufacturer said 10 to 14 business days. 10 to 14 business days. Nora did the math on what that meant in terms of shifts and patient exposure and kept her voice level. Okay, is anyone else documenting? A few people, Bev said, and said it quietly, which told Nora it wasn't official documentation. It was nurses keeping personal records, the informal parallel trail that hospital workers built when they didn't trust the official one. Keep going, Nora said. Dates, times, patient IDs, if you can do it without compromising anything. The specific behaviors of the equipment. Keep copies somewhere that isn't the hospital system. This sounds like something more than a concerned former colleague giving advice. It is, Nora said. But I can't tell you more than that right now. What I can tell you is that what you're documenting matters. Bev was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed very slightly. Not softer, but more direct, the way people spoke when they'd made a decision. You want me to call you if it happens again? Yes. Okay, Bev said, and then, Nora, you didn't just leave because they eliminated the position. No. Okay, Bev said again and hung up. Marcus Holt made his move on a Wednesday. It didn't come from him directly. That wasn't how these things worked. It came from a lawyer named Trish Vandermeer, who represented, according to the letter that arrived at Nora's motel address, Mercy Vale General Hospital's legal interests. The letter informed Nora that she had signed a confidentiality agreement as part of her employment contract, and that any disclosure of patient information or proprietary hospital operational data to third parties would constitute a breach of that agreement, and that the hospital was prepared to pursue legal remedies up to and including injunctive relief. She read the letter twice, photographed it, sent the photo to Fetters. His reply came in 40 minutes. Retain this. Do not respond directly. We're aware. She sat with the letter for a while after that. The confidentiality agreement she'd signed covered patient information. HIPAA standard, she'd read it before signing, as she always did, and nothing in it extended to covering operational safety information or equipment failures. Vandermeer's letter was stretching the language beyond what it could reasonably hold, which meant either Vandermeer was poorly briefed, or the goal wasn't legal success. The goal was to make Nora feel exposed enough to go quiet. She'd been in situations before where someone wanted her to go quiet. She thought about those situations. She thought about what had happened when she'd gone quiet and what had happened when she hadn't. She put the letter in the folder with everything else and went for a walk. Denton in late October was a particular shade of gray that she'd come to find oddly comfortable. The downtown was 3 blocks of businesses that had mostly held on: a hardware store, a pharmacy, a bar, Marta's Diner, with a few empty storefronts that had the sad dignity of places that had meant something once. She walked past all of it without really seeing it, working through the variables in her head the way she used to work through casualty scenarios, triaging the elements by urgency. The legal letter was noise. Fetters knew about it. Moving on. The Caravant pumps were still in service at Mercy Vale and at 6 other hospitals. Moving on was harder on that one because there was nothing she could do about it directly right now that wouldn't compromise what Fetters was building. She'd made this calculation before, the individual harm balanced against the systemic fix that stopping and doing it properly could achieve, and it never felt clean. It just felt like the choice that caused the least total damage. Holt knew she'd talked to someone. He didn't know who, didn't know what she had, but the legal letter told her he was nervous. Nervous people made moves. Moves left traces. She circled back to the motel, bought a sandwich from the vending machine down the hall, and kept working. So, the trace appeared 6 days later in a form she hadn't quite anticipated. Her phone rang, a Billings number, and the voice on the other end was a man who identified himself as a journalist at the Montana Tribune named Peter Solis, and he said he'd been working on a story about healthcare procurement in the state and had been pointed in her direction by a source he couldn't name. She sat with the phone at her ear for a moment, thinking through the geometry of this. A journalist, pointed toward her by a source who wasn't willing to be named. Either this was organic, a reporter who'd found the Caravant thread through independent reporting, or someone had nudged him in her direction, either to help her or to make her a visible target who might say something legally actionable. "What specifically are you reporting on?" she said. "The Caravant contract at Mercy Vale and similar contracts at other Montana facilities," Solis said. He sounded young, maybe 30, and his voice had the slightly aggressive focus of someone who believed in the story he was chasing. "I've got the contract documents through a public records request. I'm trying to understand the clinical side, what the equipment actually does in practice." "How did you get my name?" "I'd prefer not to say." "Then I'd prefer not to talk," Nora said. A pause. "I understand. Can I ask, is there anything you'd want me to know that you're not in a position to say directly?" She almost smiled. It was a good question, the kind of question that acknowledged the actual situation without trying to pretend it was something simpler. "Talk to the CMS website," she said. "Medical equipment incident reports are public. Search Caravant by manufacturer. Start in the last 2 years." "I've done that." "Then you already know what you need to know," she said. "Write the story you can write with what you have. Don't wait for me." She hung up and called Fetters. "A reporter named Solis at the Montana Tribune just contacted me," she said when he picked up. "He has the Caravant contracts from a public records request. He was pointed toward me by an unnamed source." Fetters was quiet for 2 seconds. Was the pointing from our side? I don't know. I don't think so. But I don't know. What did you tell him? To look at the CMS incident reports. Nothing he doesn't already have access to. Okay. A breath. This may accelerate things. If Holt sees press coverage coming, he may move to protect himself in ways that are visible. Or he may move to protect the evidence. Yes, Fetters said. That too. She understood what he meant. Evidence that Holt moved to protect was evidence that in moving, he might destroy. And evidence destruction was a federal crime that was significantly easier to prosecute than a complex procurement fraud scheme with a holding company in the middle. She also understood that somewhere in this timeline, there were still people in hospital beds connected to hardware that had already failed once. How close are you, she said. Closer than we were 2 weeks ago. I know it's not a number, he said. I'm sorry, it's the honest answer. She hung up and sat for a long time with the phone in her hand, and for the first time since she'd walked out of Mercyvale General, she let herself feel the specific weight of not being able to do anything immediate. She'd always been better at action than at waiting. The waiting was the part that got under your skin, that made you lie awake at 2 a.m. running scenarios that you couldn't actually affect. She lay awake at 2 a.m. running scenarios she couldn't affect. The Tribune piece ran on a Friday morning, digital first, and by the time Nora saw it at 7 a.m., it already had several hundred comments. Solis had done his homework. The story laid out the Caravant contracts at 4 Montana hospitals, the 3 CMS logged incidents, the company's Delaware incorporation and Montana registered agent, and quoted 2 anonymous hospital employees who described pressure not to document equipment issues formally. He'd also reached the public affairs office at HHS, which had given him a statement confirming that CMS was conducting a review of medical device incident reports filed by Montana healthcare facilities. He hadn't named her. He'd named Mercyvale General specifically, and he'd named Marcus Holt as CEO. Her phone had a text from Bev at 7:18. People are talking. Holt came in early. I've never seen him come in before 8. At 7:44, he's been in the records room. At 8:09, Nora. The records room is off limits now. Badge access only. IT is in there. She stared at that last message for about 4 seconds, and then she called Fetters. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he was already awake and already aware. Bev Okafor at Mercyvale says Holt came in early after the Tribune piece and is now in the records room with IT restricting access, Nora said. I know, Fetters said. We've been monitoring. We have a team 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. 17 now. She stood up from the bed and went to the window and looked out at the parking lot of the motel, at the gray morning and the wet pavement and the ordinary Thursdayness of everything outside, while 17 minutes away, Marcus Holt was in a records room trying to make things disappear before anyone could stop him. If he destroys records, she started, then he hands us something cleaner than what we had, Fetters said. I know how that sounds, but it's true. She understood the legal logic. She just couldn't make it feel like enough. The Caravant pumps, she said. After today, CMS is issuing an immediate safety notification to all 7 facilities this morning that's timed with our action. The pumps are being pulled from service today. Today. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Nora. Fetters' voice shifted slightly, dropped the operational tone for something more direct. You need to come in. Not to the hospital. There's an HHS field office in Denton, on Warren Street. I need you there in the next 45 minutes. Why? Because what happens in the next few hours is going to require someone in that room who can speak to the clinical record with first-hand authority. And because Holt's lawyers are going to move fast and we need your deposition locked before they do. She was already looking around the room for her jacket. 14 minutes, she said. I need to print something first. She printed the documentation file she'd been building for the past 3 weeks. All of it. 62 pages, every date and time and serial number and incident note and email, at the motel's business center, which had one printer that worked and one that didn't, and the one that worked jammed twice on page 47, and she had to clear the jam with a pen cap in her fingers while the clock in her head ticked the minutes down. She got to the field office on Warren Street in 18 minutes, with the papers in a manila folder under her arm and a cup of Marta's coffee that someone had brought in sitting on the table in front of her. Fetters was already there. So was Meta. So was a third person she hadn't met. A tall woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent time in a uniform, who introduced herself as Deputy Inspector General Sandra Lau. Lau shook her hand, looked at the folder, and said, "Is that everything?" 62 pages, Nora said, plus the digital originals on my phone. Lau looked at her for a moment with the specific assessment of someone who had seen a lot of people bring information into rooms like this and was deciding in real time what category this one belonged in. "Good," she said. "Sit down. We have a lot to cover, and we may have less time than we'd like." Nora sat. Outside on Warren Street, a black SUV moved past the window, headed in the direction of Mercyvale General. Then another one. She watched them pass and thought about Gerald Foss in room 14, about the silence of an alarm that should have screamed and didn't, about the 11 days she'd spent in a motel room building a 62-page file that was now in the hands of people with the authority to do something about it. Across the table, Lau opened a folder of her own and said, "Let's start with the night of October 11th. And somewhere across town, in the records room of Mercyvale General, Marcus Holt looked up from a computer terminal to find 2 federal agents standing in the doorway and realized, in the space of one breath, that the nurse he had fired 3 weeks ago had not in fact gone anywhere. The deposition took 4 hours and 12 minutes. Lau ran it with the kind of precision that didn't feel like pressure until you were 40 minutes in and realized you hadn't stopped talking since you sat down. She moved through the timeline in sequence. The first night, the pump in room 14, the administrative meeting, the termination, and then circled back through it again from different angles, checking for consistency, filling gaps, occasionally stopping to ask Nora to clarify a technical point in language that would hold up to a non-clinical reading. Nora answered everything. She was tired in the background way of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks, but tired didn't affect her recall on this. She'd written it all down too many times. It was encoded, and she could pull any date or serial number or exact phrasing without having to think about it. Around the 3rd hour, Meta got a text and showed her phone screen to Fetters without a word. Fetters' expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly. A fraction of tension releasing, the way a cable goes when the load it's been holding is finally transferred somewhere else. Nora noticed. She didn't ask. She kept answering Lau's questions. When they finished, Lau set down her pen and looked at the stack of printed pages from Nora's folder, now annotated in red in 3 different hands, and said, "This is thorough work." It needed to be. It did. Lau looked at her directly. "We executed a preservation order on the Mercyvale record systems at 8:47 this morning. Whatever Holt was attempting to do in that records room, he didn't finish it. The agents arrived before he could complete any deletions. How much did he get through? Some. Vendor communications from the last 8 months. He overwrote a directory." Lau said it flatly, without visible frustration, because she'd apparently been doing this long enough to have left visible frustration behind. "Our forensics team is working the drive. Overwritten files leave signatures. We'll recover most of it." "Most of it," Nora said. "Most of it is enough," Lau said, "especially when combined with what you brought in." Nora looked out the window of the field office. The black SUVs were gone from Warren Street. The town looked like itself, gray and ordinary and going about its business. "What happens to him now?" she said. "He's been detained for questioning. His attorney arrived 40 minutes ago. The next 24 hours will determine whether we're looking at charges today or a longer timeline." Lau paused. "I want you to understand that this is not resolved. What happened this morning is a significant development, but these cases don't end in a morning." "I know how investigations work," Nora said. Lau looked at her for a moment with an expression that held a question she didn't ask. Then she said, "I know you do," and closed her folder. Nora drove back to the motel and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes without getting out of the car, her hands on the wheel, looking at the motel's sign with one letter slightly darker than the others where a bulb had gone and been replaced with a slightly wrong wattage. She was thinking about the word most. Most of the records. Most of the evidence. Not all. And a case built on most was a case that defense attorneys built careers tearing apart. She also knew that Fetters and Lau knew this better than she did, and that this was their job, and that the correct thing for her to do right now was get out of the car and eat something and sleep. She got out of the car. She didn't eat anything immediately, and she didn't sleep, but she did go inside and sit on the edge of the bed and let herself be still for a while, which was as close as she got. Her phone rang at 4 in the afternoon. Peter Solis at the Tribune. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "I'm following up on this morning's activity at Mercy Vale," he said. "Federal vehicles were on site at the hospital. There are reports that administrative personnel were detained. Can you—" "I can't comment on any of that," she said. "Are you a witness in a federal investigation?" "I can't comment on that either." A brief pause. "Off the record, just so I understand the scope, is this bigger than one hospital?" She thought about the list Meta had shown her across the diner table. 7 hospitals, 3 states, the holding company and the family trust, and 8 months of a running investigation. "Report what you can verify," she said. "You're good at that." She hung up, and then, because she'd been putting it off for 2 days for reasons she hadn't fully examined, she called her sister in Spokane. Her sister's name was Renata, and she was 4 years older than Nora, and they had the kind of relationship that had gone through enough friction to end up in a place that was more durable than easy. Renata knew some of what Nora's life had looked like in the years before nursing. Not all of it. Enough. "You okay?" Renata said, which was how she always answered Nora's calls, like she'd been waiting for the update. "Mostly." "Where are you?" "Montana. I'm working something." Renata was quiet for a moment. "Working something like a job, or working something like the other kind of working something?" "Both," Nora said. "I'm okay. I just wanted to check in." "That means you're not sure you're okay. It means I wanted to hear a voice that wasn't a federal agent." Renata exhaled. "Call me when it's done." "Yeah," Nora said, "I will." She hung up and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. And outside the window, the Montana afternoon went dark, early the way it did in November, the light just draining out of the sky without a lot of ceremony, and she fell asleep before she meant to and woke up at 11 p.m. with her phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a text from Bev. "You need to call me." She sat up and dialed. "What?" Bev answered before the second ring. Her voice was controlled in the way that nurses' voices got controlled in situations that were bad enough to require it. "There's a situation," Bev said. "Mass casualty. Car and bus accident on Route 7, about 6 miles outside town. They're bringing them here. We don't have a trauma center, but we're the closest facility. EMS is estimating 14 victims, at least 6 critical." Nora was already on her feet. "How's your staffing?" "Night shift. 4 nurses on the floor." A pause. "We lost 2 more people this week, and the ER attending called in sick at 9. "Who's covering the ER?" "Dr. Vasquez agreed to pull a double. He's been here since 7 a.m. Nora did the math. Vasquez was 16 hours into a shift, potentially running an ER response to a 14-victim mass casualty event with 4 nurses and no backup attending. The federal agents had been at the hospital today. The administrative structure was in active disarray. The floor was already understaffed. "How many minutes until first arrivals?" she said. "EMS said 8 minutes. That was 2 minutes ago." 6 minutes. "I'm coming in," Nora said. "You're not... Your badge was deactivated." "I'm coming in anyway. Tell Vasquez." She didn't wait for Bev's response. She was already pulling on her jacket. She made it to Mercy Vale in 4 minutes, which was probably faster than she should have driven on wet streets. And she came through the emergency entrance at a pace that wasn't quite running because running in a hospital created panic. And the woman at the front desk looked at her and started to say something, and Nora said, "Vasquez knows I'm here," which was almost true, and kept moving. The ER was already noise and motion, the controlled chaos that preceded the arrival of the actual crisis. Nurses pulling crash carts and trauma supplies and setting up stations. Vasquez was at the center of it, still in his white coat from what looked like the tail end of a regular shift, his face showing the particular gray around the edges look of someone who'd been running on coffee and professional obligation for longer than was reasonable. He saw her across the room, and for a half-second she could see him calculating. The fact that she wasn't an employee, the fact that the hospital was under federal scrutiny, the fact that he had 6 critical patients arriving in under 5 minutes. "You're here," he said. "I'm here." "You're not on staff. You need clinical hands." He looked at her for another second, then he handed her a pair of gloves. "Trauma Bay 2, I'll take Bay 1. She pulled the gloves on. The first ambulance arrived 90 seconds later. What followed was the kind of work that didn't have room for anything else. The first patient through the door was a woman in her 30s, unconscious, BP crashing, obvious internal bleeding from the impact. Nora assessed her in 30 seconds and called it loud enough for Vasquez to hear across the bay. Abdominal trauma, likely splenic, we need blood, and a surgeon right now. Surgeon is 20 minutes out, someone called back. 20 minutes was too long for this blood pressure. She knew it. Vasquez knew it. And they didn't say it to each other because saying it didn't change anything. She worked. A second patient arrived in Bay 2. A teenage boy, conscious but confused, laceration on his scalp bleeding heavily, and a right arm that was sitting wrong at the elbow. Nora moved between them, stabilizing what could be stabilized, prioritizing by who would die first without intervention, making the calls that the nursing staff around her were too junior or too overwhelmed to make alone. The next 40 minutes were the kind of minutes that compressed differently than regular minutes. She put in 2 lines, reduced a shoulder dislocation on a man who screamed and then apologized for screaming, managed a tension pneumothorax that developed in Bay 1 while Vasquez was occupied, and required a needle decompression that she'd done under conditions significantly worse than this in a country she still didn't discuss, with equipment significantly less adequate than what was in this supply cabinet. The needle went in. The lung re-expanded. The man breathed. She moved on. At some point, Bev appeared at her elbow with a surgical kit, and they didn't say anything, just worked in parallel the way people worked when they'd established enough professional trust to not need narration. And an hour into it, the surgeon arrived. A woman named Dr. Farrow, who came through the door already pulling on gloves and absorbed the situation in about 10 seconds, and took over the abdominal trauma patient in Bay 2 with a nod to Nora. That meant good work. I've got it now. Nora stepped back and led her, and for the first time in over an hour, she was aware of her own heartbeat. She was also aware that there were 3 people in the waiting area who'd identified themselves as hospital administration when they arrived. People she didn't recognize, not the regular admin staff. People who'd apparently come in response to the situation and who kept looking at her and not saying anything. She knew what that meant. She went back to work. By 2 a.m., the immediate crisis had stabilized. 11 of the 14 patients were in the system, being managed. 2 had been transferred to the regional trauma center in Billings by helicopter. 1 had been DOA on arrival, a fact that settled into the room when the ER attending said it quietly, and everyone else absorbed it in the private way that hospital workers absorb these things. Not without feeling it, just without stopping. Nora was at the sink washing her hands when one of the administration people came to stand in the doorway of the bay. He was somewhere in his 40s, with the specific posture of someone who'd been sent to deliver a message they didn't write. Ms. Hallis. She kept washing her hands. Yes. I'm Ben Carraway, Interim Operations Director. I've been brought in by the board. He paused. I need to ask you to step out of the clinical area. You're not credentialed to work in this facility. She dried her hands, turned around, looked at him. There are 14 MVC patients in this building. You had 4 nurses and 1 attending when they arrived. I assisted with clinical care. Those patients are alive. I understand that. And I want to be clear that I'm not... He stopped, started again. This is a liability exposure issue. The board is already managing a significant... The board's liability exposure, Nora said, is not my patient's problem. Carraway held her gaze, and something in his expression shifted slightly, not quite conceding the argument, but acknowledging that he was standing in it and it wasn't comfortable. I'm asking you to step out of the clinical area. You can remain in the building. She looked at him for another moment. Then she pulled off her gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and walked past him into the hallway. Vasquez was at the nurse's station. He watched her come out of the bay and said nothing, but his face said enough. It's fine, she said. It's not fine, he said quietly. What you did in there tonight is done, she said. The patients are stable. That's what matters. He looked at her for a moment with something she didn't know exactly how to name. Then he said very quietly, I filed a report 6 weeks ago about the Caravant equipment, to the board, before you even arrived. She looked at him. What happened to it? I received a response informing me that the matter had been reviewed and the equipment had been approved for use. He picked up a pen, set it back down. I didn't push it further. I should have. She thought about what that cost him to say. You pushed it when it counted, she said. The incident with Gerald Foss, you made the calls, you documented it. You documented it, he said. I wrote the order. There's a difference. She didn't argue the point because it wasn't the right moment for that. Vasquez, what you know about that initial report, have you told the federal investigators? He looked up at her. They haven't contacted me. They will, she said. When they do, tell them everything. He held her gaze and nodded once, and she understood from the quality of the nod that he'd already made this decision before she suggested it and was simply waiting for confirmation that someone else saw the same ground she was standing on. She went and found a chair in the hallway near the ER waiting area and sat in it for a few minutes, which was all she was going to allow herself. And in those minutes, she thought about Caraway saying liability exposure and Holt in the records room this morning and the 7 hospitals and the timeline and the word most. She also thought about the woman in Bay 2, the one with the abdominal trauma, who had been conscious enough in the early phase to grab Nora's wrist with a surprising amount of grip for someone losing blood pressure, and had said something Nora hadn't had time to respond to in the moment. She'd said, "Am I going to be okay?" And Nora had said, "Not yet, but you're going to get there," which was the most truthful version of reassurance she could offer. Not a promise, not a fantasy, just the direction of travel. The woman was in surgery now. Dr. Farrow would do good work. Nora stood up from the chair and took out her phone. She texted Fetters at 2:24 a.m. Mass casualty event tonight at Mercy Vale. I assisted clinically. You should know before it becomes a report. His reply came at 2:31. I know. We were monitoring hospital communications. Are you all right? She stared at that last question for a moment. It was a different kind of question than the ones he'd been asking in the field office, a more direct one. Fine, she typed back. I need to talk to you in the morning about something Vasquez told me. 7 a.m. Warren Street. She was about to put the phone away when a second message came in, not from Fetters, from a number she didn't recognize, a 202 area code, which was Washington, D.C. The message said, Ms. Hallis. I understand you may have been involved in clinical response at Mercy Vale this evening. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. Colonel D. Pruitt, U.S. Army Medical Command. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She looked up from her phone at the hallway of Mercy Vale General, at the fluorescent lighting and the linoleum and the nurses moving past with the careful efficiency of people at the end of a very long night, and she felt something happen in her chest that wasn't quite anything she had a clean word for. Not surprise, exactly. She'd known, in the abstract, that this was a possible consequence of the OIG involvement, that military records had a way of surfacing once federal scrutiny reached a certain level. She'd understood it as a theoretical outcome. Seeing it as a name and a rank in a text message at 2 a.m. was a different experience. She thought about what the 202 area code meant and what Army Medical Command meant, and why a colonel would be contacting her at this hour rather than through official channels during business hours. She thought about that for a moment, and then she thought about what might prompt someone at that level to move outside the normal schedule. What kind of information would generate enough urgency to text a former service member at 2 a.m. after a civilian incident at a Montana hospital? She looked at the text again. At your earliest convenience. It was formal language, but the hour said something else, something that didn't feel like routine. She typed back, I'm available tomorrow morning. I'll be at a federal field office on Warren Street in Denton, Montana from 7 a.m. The reply came in less than 2 minutes. I'll be there at 9. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the hallway for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that the ground they're standing on is larger than they thought. She'd been fired 3 weeks ago from a night shift position at a hospital in a small Montana city, carrying a duffel bag and a gas station coffee. She'd been treated as a problem to be managed out the door, an inconvenient voice on an inconvenient subject, a nurse who didn't understand the complexity of administrative decisions and needed to be thanked and shown to the exit. And now there was a colonel flying to Denton. She walked back toward the ER entrance, not because there was anything she could do clinically anymore, but because she needed to move, needed the physical motion of going somewhere to match the internal motion of everything reconfiguring. Vasquez was still at the nurse's station. He looked up when she came back. "How are your patients?" she said. "Stable. All of them." He paused. "For now." She nodded. "Go home, Vasquez. You've been here over 18 hours. "I will, when the morning shift comes in." She looked at him. "When did the morning shift start cutting people?" He didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. She stood there for another moment and then said, "I'm going to need a list of every nurse and physician who left this hospital in the last 6 months. If they left because of Holt or because of the equipment situation or because of anything that felt like retaliation for raising concerns, I need to know their names." Vasquez looked at her with a careful expression. "That's a significant request." "I know. Is this for the federal investigation?" "It's for the people who deserve to be heard in it." He picked up a pen, put it back down, picked it up again. "Give me until tomorrow afternoon," he said. "I'll do what I can." She left through the emergency entrance and walked to her car in the pre-dawn cold, her breath showing in the air, the parking lot lit unevenly the way it always was with the lights that still flickered. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The coal-black sky over Denton was starting to show something lighter at the eastern edge. Barely. The way darkness gave up at the margins before it gave up anywhere else. She thought about Colonel D. Pruitt and what Army Medical Command was. Army Medical Command was not routine oversight. It was not a standard liaison function. It was the branch that coordinated the intersection of military medical infrastructure with civilian emergency response, that had oversight of classified medical programs, and the service records of personnel who'd worked in contexts that didn't appear in standard military biography. Which meant that Pruitt wasn't coming because the OIG had flagged her employment history in passing. Pruitt was coming because someone had specifically directed him here, because what was happening at Mercy Vale and what was in Nora's service record had been connected by someone with the clearance level to see both simultaneously. She thought about that connection and what it meant, and what it might mean for what happened next. She thought about the 7 hospitals and the holding company and the procurement fraud and Holt in the records room trying to make 8 months of communications disappear. She thought about Gerald Foss's heartbeat under her fingers at 2 a.m. on a night 3 weeks ago, irregular and frightened, reorganizing itself one beat at a time into something that held. She started the car. She needed 3 hours of sleep and a change of clothes and something to eat in that order. And at 7 a.m. she was going to walk into the field office on Warren Street, and at 9 a.m. a colonel was going to walk in behind her. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove east toward the motel, into the thin gray edge of morning. Her phone buzzed one more time. Not Fetters, not Pruitt. A number she recognized this time, Bev's cell, and the message was 2 sentences. The board convened an emergency session tonight. They're trying to vote to close the ER and transfer all acute patients before the investigators return in the morning. She read Bev's message twice, sitting in the parking lot with the engine running and the heater just starting to push warm air against the cold. The board was moving to close the ER, not to fix it, not to address the staffing, to close it, which would mean transferring every acute patient currently in the building, disrupting 14 MVC victims in the middle of the night, and ensuring that when federal investigators returned in the morning, the thing they'd come to examine would have been administratively dismantled. She called Fetters. He answered on the second ring, which told her he was still awake. "The Mercy Vale board is in emergency session," she said. "They're voting to close the ER and transfer acute patients." A silence that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand he was processing the legal geometry of it. "When did the session start?" "I don't know. Bev just texted me." "Are patients being moved yet?" "I don't know that either." "Stay where you are," he said. "I'm making a call." He hung up. She stayed where she was for about 45 seconds and then drove back toward the hospital, because staying where you were was a reasonable instruction in a lot of situations, and not reasonable in this one. The ER entrance was lit and occupied. 2 ambulances she recognized from the earlier arrivals were still parked at the bay, which meant the logistics of a transfer hadn't started yet. She pulled into the visitor lot, not the staff lot, and sat in the car and watched the building. Her phone rang. Fetters. "We're filing for a temporary restraining order on patient transfer," he said. "It's going to take 40 minutes to an hour to execute. I need you to understand that there is a window." "I understand." "Don't go back inside the building." "I heard you." Nora, I heard you, she said again, which was not a promise. She stayed in the car. She watched the entrance. At 3:18 a.m., two men she didn't recognize came out through the main doors. Suits, not scrubs, the specific posture of people who'd been in a conference room and were now moving to execute a decision. One of them made a phone call, the other walked toward the ambulance bay. She got out of the car. She walked toward the entrance not because she was going inside, but because she needed to be close enough to see clearly what was happening. And when the man near the ambulance bay made eye contact with her, she didn't look away. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavy-set, the look of a man who'd been woken up and driven here and was operating on whatever combination of institutional loyalty and self-preservation had gotten him out of bed. He looked at her for a moment and then looked away, which told her he knew who she was. Bev came through the entrance doors. She looked at Nora and then at the man near the ambulance bay and then back at Nora, and her expression was the expression of someone who had spent the last hour trying to hold something together that kept wanting to come apart. They voted, Bev said quietly when she was close enough. 7-2. Effective transfer of all acute patients beginning at 0400. Vasquez? He's in there. He's arguing. A pause. They're not listening. Nora looked at the entrance doors. The federal restraining order is 40 minutes out, maybe less. Bev stared at her. You called. Fetters is handling it. Nobody moves patients until that order lands. She looked at Bev directly. Go back inside. Tell Vasquez to request that any transfer be delayed pending confirmation of receiving facility readiness. He doesn't need to mention the federal order. Just use the clinical protocol. No transfer of acute post-trauma patients without confirmed receiving capacity and transport-level nursing. Bev absorbed this for a moment. That buys us maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes is what we need, Nora said. Bev went back inside. The man near the ambulance bay was still on his phone. Nora stood in the parking lot in the cold and watched the building and waited, which was the hardest thing, and the thing she'd gotten most practiced at. The restraining order arrived at 3:51 a.m. She knew it had arrived because three things happened in sequence. Fetters texted her a single word, done, and then a federal vehicle she recognized from the morning pulled into the hospital lot. And then, through the glass of the entrance doors, she could see the quality of the argument inside the building change. The two suited men had been moving with the confidence of people implementing a decision. Now they were standing still. She didn't go inside. She stood in the parking lot and watched through the glass and let the legal mechanism do what legal mechanisms existed to do. At 4:09 a.m., the ambulances drove away empty. At 4:22 a.m., Vasquez texted her. Transfer canceled. Board's attorneys are on the phone with someone. It's loud. She texted back, Go check on your patients. His reply, Already am. She got in her car and drove to the motel. She set an alarm for 6 a.m., lay down on top of the covers, and was asleep in under 3 minutes. Sick. The field office on Warren Street was different at 7 a.m. than it had been the day before. More people. For one thing, 2 additional agents she hadn't met, and a woman from the Department of Justice who introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Dana Hirsch, compact and direct, and carrying a briefcase that she set on the table and opened without preamble. Hirsch was the one who told her about the restraining order's downstream effect. The board's attempted patient transfer triggered a CMS emergency review, she said, arranging papers in a way that suggested she'd been awake for a while. When a hospital under federal procurement inquiry attempts to move acute patients following the initiation of a preservation order, it creates a specific legal exposure that changes our timeline. Changes how? Nora said. It accelerates it. Hirsch looked up from the papers. The board's action last night effectively constituted obstruction. Not just the records room. The patient transfer attempt was an attempt to disrupt an active investigation by removing the clinical population whose care records are material to the case. She said it with the flat precision of someone who spent her days converting human situations into legal language. We're filing charges this morning. Marcus Holt, and 3 board members who were present for the vote. Nora sat with that for a moment. Charges: healthcare fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of a federal investigation. Hirsch paused. The forensics team recovered the overwritten files from the records room. 83% restoration. It was enough. Nora thought about Lau saying most of it is enough. turned out to be true. Holt's attorney is going to move for a deal, Fetters said from across the table. He already tried last night. The answer was no. Why no? Nora said. Because what he's offering isn't worth what he knows, Hirsch said. And what he knows is going to come out in discovery anyway. The deal he's offering us isn't worth the cost of letting him partially walk. Nora looked at her. He knows about the other hospitals. He knows about the other hospitals, Hirsch confirmed. He also knows about the financial structure, specifically the mechanism through which Rimrock Capital Partners compensated him for directing the Caravant contracts. That structure implicates 2 other hospital CEOs in Wyoming and Colorado. She closed her briefcase with a small, decisive click. We don't need his deal, we have the structure. Outside, a car pulled into the lot on Warren Street. Not federal. Civilian. Black sedan. Nora watched it through the window without turning her head. At 9 o'clock, Colonel D. Pruitt walked through the door. He was in civilian clothes, which she'd half expected. A colonel arriving in uniform to a field office in a small Montana city would create exactly the kind of visibility that nobody wanted right now. He was somewhere in his early 50s with the specific physical economy of someone who'd spent years in environments where efficiency of movement was practical rather than aesthetic. And he had a handshake that was firm without making a point of it. He introduced himself to Hirsch and Fetters by name and rank, and then sat down across from Nora and looked at her with the particular quality of attention that people used when they were trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same person. Ms. Hallis, he said. Colonel, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've read your service record, the unredacted version. She held his gaze. Okay. I've also read the incident report from the night of October 11th, and the clinical documentation from last night's MVC response. He folded his hands on the table. I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. When you responded to the crash in room 14, the needle decompression last night, the VTAC management, the triage decisions, were you drawing on your military medical training? Yes, Sisti, she said. I'm always drawing on it. That doesn't go away. He nodded slowly, like this was an answer he'd expected but needed confirmed. Your training was conducted under a classified program that no longer operates under its original designation. You're aware of this. I am. The reason I'm here, Pruitt said, is not to discuss the criminal investigation. That's Ms. Hirsch's territory and it's being handled. He paused. The reason I'm here is that Army Medical Command has an interest in what happens to personnel who are trained under that program when they surface in civilian contexts. Specifically, an interest in making sure the record reflects the full scope of their capabilities. Nora looked at him. You want to unseal something? I want to ensure that the record that exists in this case, he said carefully, does not inadvertently misrepresent the qualifications of the person at the center of it. She understood what he was saying, and also what he wasn't saying. The federal case against Holt would involve testimony about her clinical actions. If her background appeared in that testimony as simply a nurse, it created an incomplete picture that defense attorneys could use to challenge the credibility of her clinical judgments. The complete picture, the training, the deployments, the classified context, was a different category of qualification entirely. You want to make the record accurate, she said. I want to make it complete, he said. With your consent. She thought about this, about what it meant to let that part of her history into a federal courtroom, about the years she'd spent keeping it separate, keeping herself small and quiet and one step removed from the version of herself that had operated in those contexts. She also thought about Hirsch's briefcase clicking shut, about 83% restoration being enough, about Gerald Foss's heartbeat. Yes, she said, with my consent. Pruitt nodded. He reached into the bag beside his chair and produced a single document, not a file, just one page, and slid it across the table toward her. She didn't read it immediately. She looked at it for a moment, at the header and the classification markings and the specific bureaucratic language that meant something real had been set in motion. Then she picked it up and read it and signed it and slid it back. The arrests happened at 11 a.m. Not all of them at once. Holt was already in federal custody from the previous day's records room incident, upgraded now to formal charges rather than detention. The 3 board members were picked up at their respective homes and offices. and the Tribune had a photographer outside Mercyvale General when the last of them was walked out through the main entrance, which was not a coincidence Nora entirely believed. She wasn't there for it. She was still on Warren Street going through a second round of questions with Hirsch that was less deposition and more strategy session. Hirsch walking through the elements of the case and what testimony would be needed to establish each one. Nora providing the clinical specifics that translated the procurement fraud into real-world patient impact. It was detailed and unglamorous work, the work of converting a lived experience into something that would hold up in a federal courtroom, and it took another 3 hours. When she walked out of the field office at 2 p.m., Peter Solis was standing on the sidewalk. She stopped. He was not aggressive about it. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he wasn't blocking her path. And his expression was the expression of someone who'd been waiting long enough to have thought carefully about how he was going to handle this. "I know you can't comment on an active investigation," he said. "I'm not asking you to." She looked at him. "Then what are you asking? I've been reporting on this for 2 months. I had the Caravant contracts before you walked in that door." He paused. "I know more than you might think I know. I'm not here to get a quote. I'm here because I want to know if what I'm about to publish tonight is accurate." She stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and looked at him and made a decision that was more instinct than calculation. "Tell me what you have," she said. He told her. It was thorough. The Caravant structure, the Rimrock connection, the holding company, the Montana contracts, the CMS incident reports. He had the Tribune's legal team sign off on all of it. He had 3 named sources she didn't recognize, which meant they'd come to him independently. There was one element he was uncertain about: the financial compensation mechanism between Rimrock and Holt, the family trust structure. "The trust exists," she said carefully. "I can tell you that's accurate. I can't tell you how I know that." He looked at her for a moment. "That's enough," he said. She walked to her car. He walked back toward the Tribune's office on the other side of Warren Street, and she watched him go and thought about the distance between what she could say and what she could confirm, and the difference between the two, and whether she'd threaded that needle correctly. She decided she had and drove to get lunch, which she'd been intending to do since breakfast. The Tribune piece ran online at 6 that evening with a headline that was specific enough to be unmistakable and restrained enough to be credible, the kind of headline that told you the editor had been careful. By 8 o'clock it had been picked up by the AP wire, and by 9 it was on the national news sites. And by 10, Nora's phone was ringing with numbers she didn't recognize that she let go to voicemail. She sat in the motel room and watched the story propagate across the internet, with the odd detachment of someone watching something that they were inside of from a slight remove. Names, now public, that she'd been moving around in her head for weeks. Dollar amounts in the Caravant contracts. Patient incident numbers. A quote from a CMS spokesperson confirming the safety notification and the suspension of Caravant equipment across all 7 facilities. The last line of Solis's piece was a sentence she read twice. At least 14 patients at Mercyvale General Hospital may owe their continued care to a nurse who was fired 3 weeks before she helped save their lives. She didn't know how he knew about the MVC response. She supposed nurses talked. She turned off the phone screen and stared at the ceiling. What she felt was not triumph. It was something more complicated and less clean. The specific kind of exhaustion that came at the end of something that had required sustained effort across a long time, when the adrenaline that had been keeping everything moving started to metabolize and left the weight of everything underneath it visible. She was aware of her own body in the way she hadn't been for weeks. The tension across her shoulders, the persistent headache she'd been managing with water and ignoring, the fact that she'd been sleeping in 4 to 5 hour increments for the better part of a month. She was also aware that it wasn't finished. Holt was in custody. 3 board members were charged. The pumps were out of service. The investigation was running. These were all real things. They were also the first half of something. The legal process was its own organism, with its own timeline and its own appetite. And the distance between an arrest and an outcome was long and not straight and had a lot of room in it for things to go sideways. She knew this. She'd been in situations before where the initial action worked and the aftermath unraveled. She'd also been in situations where the opposite happened, where the initial action was messy and incomplete, and the aftermath sorted itself out better than expected. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes and let herself do nothing for a while, which was still harder than almost anything else. "What?" Vasquez called her the next morning, a Tuesday, while she was at Marta's diner with a cup of actual good coffee and something resembling a real breakfast. "The board is in chaos," he said. He sounded tired in the way people sounded when they'd been holding an institution together through a crisis with their bare hands. "The 3 who were arrested have resigned. The 4 who voted against the transfer are trying to reconstitute governance. They've brought in an outside administrator." "Who?" "Someone from the Montana Hospital Association. Her name is Greta Wills. She's been through one other hospital restructuring." He paused. "She reached out to me this morning. She wants a clinical assessment of the floor, staffing, equipment, patient safety protocols." "Good," Nora said. "She also asked me for names of staff who left in the last 6 months." Another pause. "I put together the list you asked for. 11 nurses, 2 attending physicians, 1 pharmacist." Nora set down her coffee cup. 11 nurses. She'd known the number was significant. She hadn't put a number on it. "You said some of them left because of the equipment situation or because of retaliation." 7 of the 11 who left cited conditions. Not officially. Officially, it was personal reasons, better opportunities, but I knew 4 of them personally, and I know what they told me when I asked directly. "Forward the list to Fetters," she said. "I'll give you his email." "I already have it." A brief pause that held something in it. "He called me yesterday. We talked for an hour." She absorbed this. "What did you tell him?" "Everything," Vasquez said, "including the report I filed 6 weeks ago and what happened to it." His voice went flatter, not quite without emotion, but with the emotion compressed to a controlled minimum. The report went to the board's quality committee. The chair of the quality committee was one of the 3 who were arrested yesterday. She sat with that for a moment. The report he'd filed, the one he'd described to her at the nurse's station in the middle of the night, hadn't gone nowhere. It had gone exactly somewhere. It had gone to someone who had every reason to make it disappear. "Vasquez," she said. "Yeah. That report is now material evidence. Fetters will explain what that means, but the short version is that it establishes knowledge at the board level. It changes the nature of the charges." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. And then, "Is that the right word?" "Yeah," she said. "It is." She finished breakfast and paid and drove, without a clear destination initially, moving through Denton's streets in the gray November morning with the radio off and the heater running and the particular clarity that came the day after the main thing happened, when the field opened up a little. She found herself driving slowly past Mercyvale General. The exterior looked the same as it always had: beige concrete, uneven lighting, the parking lot with its old pavement. There were 2 news vans in the lot, which was new, and she could see a reporter doing a stand-up near the entrance, with the building sign visible behind her. She drove past without stopping. Hirsch called her at noon. "I wanted to update you on something," Hirsch said, and her voice had a slightly different quality than it had in the field office. Not warmer exactly, but less compressed. "Holt's attorney approached us again this morning with a revised offer." Same answer? "Different situation now. The board member arrest changed the calculus." A pause. "Holt is offering to testify against the other 2 hospital CEOs in Wyoming and Colorado in exchange for a reduced charge set. We're evaluating it." Nora looked out through the windshield at the parking lot of the hardware store where she'd pulled over to take the call. "Is his testimony worth it?" "His testimony, plus the financial records we recovered, would close cases that are currently relying heavily on documentary evidence without a cooperating witness." Hirsch said it carefully, laying out the legal logic the way she laid out everything, in columns. "I'm not asking your opinion on whether we take the deal. I'm telling you it's on the table so that if it results in a charge reduction for Holt, you're not surprised when you see it." "I appreciate that," Nora said. "I also want to tell you something else." Hirsch paused for a moment that felt deliberate. "Colonel Pruitt filed the declassification request with DOD this morning. The timeline is 30 to 60 days for processing. If it's approved, and I have reason to believe it will be, your complete service record will be part of the evidentiary record in this case." Nora was quiet. "That has implications beyond this case," Hirsch said. "I want to make sure you've thought through what that means for you personally." "I've thought about it," Nora said. "Your background, what you did, the context you operated in, it changes how you're perceived, not just in the courtroom, generally." "I know. Some people find that uncomfortable," Hirsch said. after a long time of being anonymous. Nora looked through the windshield at the hardware store across the lot, at a man loading bags of rock salt into the back of a truck, ordinary and unhurried. I was anonymous because it was necessary, she said, not because I needed to be. Hirsch absorbed this. All right, she said. I'll be in touch as the timeline develops. She was back at the motel when her phone showed a call from a number she didn't know. Not the 202 area code this time. A Montana exchange, local. She answered. Ms. Hallis, a woman's voice, measured and direct. My name is Greta Wills. I've been brought in as interim administrator at Mercyvale General. I believe you know the name. I do, Nora said. I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing the clinical record of this hospital, the staffing history, and the incident documentation. A pause. I've also spoken with Dr. Vasquez, with Nurse Okafor, and with the federal investigators handling the criminal case. Another pause, briefer. I'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. What about? Nora said. About what this hospital needs to be, Wills said, and about the people who should be involved in deciding that. Nora thought about this, about what this hospital needs to be meant coming from someone who'd been brought in specifically to restructure a failed institution, about the 11 nurses and 2 physicians who'd left in 6 months, about the 4 nurses who'd been on shift during a 14-victim mass casualty event, about Gerald Foss and the machine that didn't alarm, and the heartbeat that reorganized itself one beat at a time into something that held. I can meet tomorrow morning, Nora said. Marta's Diner, 9 o'clock. I'll be there, Will said. Thank you. The call ended. Nora sat on the edge of the bed for a moment with the phone in her hand, and then she opened her laptop and started writing. Not a report, not documentation, just notes. The kind of notes you made when you were trying to think something through. What a hospital like Mercyvale needed. Not in the abstract, not in policy language, but concretely. Staffing ratios, equipment standards, documentation protocols, the specific things that had failed and the specific fixes that addressed the failures rather than the optics. She wrote for 2 hours, which was longer than she meant to, and when she stopped, the notes were 7 pages long and her coffee had gone cold. She read back through what she'd written. It was, she realized, the beginning of something. Not just a list of fixes. The architecture of a floor that would actually work. She saved it and closed the laptop and went to refill the coffee from the motel's hallway machine. And when she came back and sat down again, she had the particular sensation of something having shifted that she couldn't entirely locate. Some weight in the room that had been constant for weeks and was no longer quite where it had been. She was still sitting there, thinking about Wills's call and the 7 pages of notes and what tomorrow morning's conversation might look like, when her phone lit up again. Not a call, a text. From Fetters. It was 2 sentences, and she read them once and then read them again and sat very still. Caravant Medical Systems has filed for bankruptcy protection as of this afternoon. Their legal counsel has informed us that the CEO is prepared to cooperate fully with the federal investigation in exchange for personal immunity. She stared at the screen. Caravant's CEO. Cooperating meant the financial architecture would be laid out from the inside. Not reconstructed from recovered documents and forensic accounting, but described directly by the person who designed it. Every payment, every relationship, every hospital, every CEO on the other end of the Rimrock chain. It meant the case that had been built carefully across 8 months, that had been solid and was getting more solid, was about to become something else entirely. Not just solid. Airtight. She was still processing this when a second text arrived, and this one wasn't from Fetters. It was from Bev. There's a man here asking for you. Says he's from the Department of Justice. He's got someone with him. A woman in a military uniform. Nora looked at the text. She'd expected Pruitt to be done. The document signed, the request filed, his part of this complete. She hadn't expected him to come back. She typed back to Bev. Tell them I'm on my way. She grabbed her jacket. She was almost at the door when her phone buzzed one final time. An email notification. Sender she didn't recognize, subject line that made her stop moving entirely. The subject line read, Classified personnel file, declassification approved, immediate effect. 30 to 60 days, Hirsch had said. It had been less than 24 hours. She read the email subject line one more time, standing in the motel room doorway with her jacket half on, and then she finished putting on her jacket and walked out. The declassification had moved in less than 24 hours, which meant Prewitt hadn't filed a standard request. He'd invoked an expedited channel, the kind that existed for active federal proceedings where classified information was material to an ongoing case. She'd known such channels existed. She'd never been on this end of one. It changed the weight of things, not the facts. The facts had always been what they were, but the weight. She drove to Mercy Vale with the heat on and the radio off and thought about what it meant for a document to exist in two states, sealed and unsealed, classified and declassified, and how the information inside it was identical in both states, but carried entirely different consequences depending on which side of that line it lived on. For years, she'd been on the sealed side, and she'd built a life that fit around that, a life that was quieter and smaller and more maneuverable than it would have been otherwise. She was about to find out what the other side looked like. The hospital parking lot had more cars than she'd expected for a Wednesday afternoon. News vans were still positioned near the entrance, and there was a cluster of people near the main doors that resolved, as she got closer, into what looked like hospital staff. Not on a break, not leaving for the day. Standing together in the specific way that people stood together when something had happened and they didn't know yet whether to feel afraid or relieved. Bev met her at the entrance. "He's in the conference room on 2, Bev said, and then looked at her for a moment. "There are a lot of people who want to talk to you today." "I know," Nora said. "The staff out front." Bev glanced back at the cluster near the doors. "They came in on their day off. Word got around about the arrests about last night. Some of them were here for the MVC response. Some of them are the ones who left in the last 6 months." Nora looked at the group. 15, maybe 20 people. Nurses, a couple of physicians she half recognized, a woman in pharmacy scrubs. "They're not going anywhere?" she said. "No," Bev said. "They're waiting." Nora looked at them a moment longer, then went inside. The conference room on the second floor was the same one where she'd sat across from Holt and Wheeler and watched Holt recalibrate his approach to her in real time 5 weeks ago. The table was the same. The carpet cleaner smell was mostly the same. But the people in the room were entirely different. Prewitt was there, and he was in uniform this time. Dress greens, the kind you wore when the occasion required a visible statement about what you represented. Beside him was a woman Nora didn't know, also in uniform, a lieutenant colonel whose name tape read Ashby. On the civilian side of the table sat Hirsch and Fetters, and at the head of the table, Greta Wills, who turned out to be a small woman in her 60s with silver hair cut practically short, and the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by institutional failure and was focused entirely on what came next. They all looked at Nora when she came in. She sat down. Prewitt spoke first. "I owe you an explanation about the timeline, he said. "The expedited declassification wasn't my decision alone. It was requested jointly by DOD and the Department of Justice because of where this case is going." "Where is it going?" Nora said. Hirsch took it from there. Caravant's CEO, his name is Stuart Finch, began formal cooperation at 2 o'clock this afternoon. In the first hour of his interview, he described a procurement coordination scheme that involves 9 hospitals across 4 states, 18 months of contract manipulation, and a financial structure that ran through 3 separate holding companies above Rimrock. She paused to let the number land. 9 hospitals. Nora had known 7. 7 had already felt large. 2 of those hospitals are in states with their own ongoing attorney general investigations, Hirsch continued. This has become a multi-jurisdictional federal case. The scale of it, she stopped. And the stop was itself informative, because Hirsch didn't stop mid-sentence for nothing. The scale of it is significant enough that the U.S. Attorney's Office has formally taken over primary jurisdiction from the OIG, which means my role changes and the resources behind this change. "What does that mean for the timeline?" Nora said. "It means Holt's preliminary hearing is being moved up. It means charges across all 9 hospitals will be filed simultaneously in a coordinated action, which is scheduled for Friday morning." Hirsch folded her hands on the table. "It means that your testimony, your clinical documentation, your service record, your account of what happened in room 14 and what happened last night is now part of a case that is significantly larger than the one you walked into a federal field office to report 5 weeks ago. The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at Pruitt. The declassification. Your complete service record is now part of the evidentiary file, he said. That means it's also part of the public record once the case proceeds to trial. He said it without apology, but not without awareness of what it meant. I want to make sure you understood the implications before we got here. You told me 30 to 60 days, she said. I told you that was the standard timeline, he said. I didn't tell you I was filing through the standard channel. She looked at him. Why the urgency? Because what Finch is telling us describes a pattern. Hospitals that were deliberately equipped with substandard devices by administrators who profited from the contracts. Patients across 9 facilities in 4 states who received care on equipment that had documented failure modes. He paused. The clinical authority of the person who first identified and documented this failure matters enormously to the credibility of what comes next. Defense attorneys are going to argue that the risk was overstated, that the equipment failures were isolated, that the response was disproportionate. Your background, your actual training and experience, is the counterweight to that argument. It needed to be in the record before Friday. She sat with this for a moment. The logic was sound. The logic was also that her history, the years she'd kept separate, the specific operational context she'd never discussed in civilian settings, was now going to be read into a federal court record in a case that the AP wire was already covering. Okay, she said. Pruitt looked at her. That's it? What else would you like me to say? He almost smiled. Nothing, that'll do. Wills cleared her throat from the head of the table, and everyone's attention shifted to her. I'd like to use the remaining time to discuss the hospital, she said, in the tone of someone who had allocated exactly the right amount of patience to the federal portion of the meeting and was now moving on. Specifically, what it's going to take to make it functional again. The conversation with Wills took an hour and covered ground that Nora had partly mapped in her 7 pages of notes from the previous night. Staffing ratios, equipment replacement, the incident reporting system, which needed to be rebuilt from scratch to remove the bottlenecks that had allowed Holt's quality committee chair to suppress Vasquez's report, a new clinical governance structure that put physicians and senior nurses in the review chain rather than routing everything through administration. Wills listened to all of it with focused attention and asked sharp, specific follow-up questions. Not the questions of someone who needed to be convinced, but the questions of someone who was already building a plan and needed the details to be precise. You wrote this down, Wills said at one point, looking at the printed copy of Nora's notes that Fetters had apparently passed along. Last night, Nora said. 7 pages in one sitting. I'd been thinking about it for 5 weeks. Wills looked at the pages for a moment and then looked at Nora with the specific quality of attention that preceded a direct question. I want to ask you something I'll only ask once. Nora waited. If I offered you a position in clinical leadership here, not administration, not a desk, something that put you on the floor with authority over the things you've described, would you consider it? The room was quiet enough that Nora could hear the building's heating system running. She thought about this question honestly, which meant she thought about the part of it that was tempting and the part of it that was complicated and the part of it that she hadn't figured out yet. She'd come to Denton with a duffel bag and a gas station coffee and a need for small and quiet. And what had happened instead was the opposite of that, and she wasn't sure yet what that meant for what came next. I'll consider it, she said. Wills nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected and moved on to the next item on her list. The preliminary hearing for Marcus Holt took place on a Friday morning in a federal courthouse in Billings, 60 miles from Denton, and Nora drove there in the dark before dawn because the hearing was at 8 a.m. and she needed to be in the building by 7:30. Hirsch had told her she wouldn't be called to testify at the preliminary hearing. That was for later, for the actual trial, but she'd asked Nora to be present, and Nora had said yes without a lot of deliberation. She got there early enough to find a seat in the gallery, 3rd row, near the aisle, where she could see the front of the room. She wasn't in scrubs, she was in the closest thing she owned to professional clothes. Dark slacks, a gray jacket she'd bought at a Denton department store 2 days ago because she'd looked at her wardrobe and accepted that she needed something that wasn't either work clothes or motel room casual wear. The room filled gradually. Hirsch and her team at the prosecution table, organized and quiet. The defense team on the other side, 4 attorneys for Holt alone, and she recognized the lead attorney's name from a firm in Denver that specialized in white-collar federal cases. They were expensive, and they were competent, and they were going to make this as long and complicated as the law allowed. The 3 board members who'd been charged were there too, with their own counsel, at a separate table. Holt came in last, walked through from a side door with a marshal at his elbow, and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes moved across the gallery and found her. She'd wondered if they would. She thought he'd probably been told she'd be here. She looked back at him steadily. He looked away first. She'd expected to feel something sharp when that happened. Satisfaction, or anger finishing itself off, or something that matched the size of the last 5 weeks. What she felt instead was quieter, more like the specific stillness that came at the end of a long operation when you finally stood down and your body was catching up to the fact that the thing you'd been running toward was over. He looked smaller in here than he had behind a hospital administrator's desk. That happens sometimes. The context that made someone powerful was also the context that made them look large, and stripped that away, and what remained was just a person sitting in a room where other people held all the cards. The judge came in. Everyone rose. The hearing ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Hirsch presented the charges: healthcare fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of a federal investigation, reckless endangerment, with the methodical clarity that was her native mode. Each count laid out in sequence with the statutory basis and the evidentiary support summarized efficiently. The defense made arguments she'd expected them to make: that the equipment failures were manufacturer issues rather than administrative decisions, that the procurement choices were made in good faith, that the records room incident was a misunderstanding about the scope of the preservation order. Hirsch dismantled each one without raising her voice. The part that Nora hadn't quite anticipated was when Hirsch addressed the clinical record directly. The incident in room 14, the failed alarm, the chain of decisions that had led from a Caravant contract approval to Gerald Foss's VTAC at 2 a.m. Hirsch had told her she wouldn't testify today, and she didn't, but Hirsch described the incident in clinical detail that left no interpretive room. And then she said, "The nurse who intervened that night, whose documentation forms the cornerstone of the clinical record in this case, is a former U.S. Army combat medic who served for 7 years in classified special operations medical roles. Her qualifications are part of the federal evidentiary record." She felt the gallery shift slightly around her. Not dramatically. No one turned and pointed, but there was a perceptible change in the quality of attention, the way a room's atmosphere changed when new information entered it, and people were still deciding what to do with it. She looked at the front of the room and kept her face even. The judge denied bail for Holt on the grounds of flight risk given the financial resources involved, a decision that Hirsch had apparently expected because her expression didn't change at all when it was announced. The board members received conditional bail with passport surrenders and travel restrictions. When the session closed, Nora filed out with the gallery and found Hirsch in the hallway. "That went as well as it could," Hirsch said. "The bail denial was good," Nora said. "It was. His attorneys will appeal it, but they won't win." Hirsch looked at her for a moment. "How are you doing with all of it?" It was a different kind of question than Hirsch usually asked, and the difference was noticeable. "Working on it," Nora said. Hirsch nodded. "The trial date will be set in the next 30 days. We'll need you for testimony prep starting about 6 weeks before that. I'll be in touch." She paused. "You did the right thing, all of it, from the first night to this morning." She said it without ceremony, the way she said most things, which made it land more cleanly than it would have with more weight put on it. Nora drove back to Denton in early afternoon light that was doing its best against the November sky, which was the same gray it had been for weeks, but with something slightly different in it, the quality of gray that came before things changed, rather than after. She met with Greta Wills again on a Monday morning, a week after the hearing, in a Mercy Vale conference room that still smelled like carpet cleaner but had different people in it. Wills, Vasquez, Bev, and 2 nurses Nora didn't know who turned out to be returning staff. 2 of the 11 who'd left, coming back now that the administrative structure had fundamentally changed. The meeting was about the clinical governance proposal Nora had outlined in her notes. Wills had taken it, added to it, and was now presenting a version of it that was more institutional than Nora's original draft, but preserved the core of what she'd argued for. A clinical review committee with actual authority, staffing ratios that reflected patient acuity rather than budget targets, an incident reporting chain that bypassed administration and went directly to a clinical ethics board. Nora sat through the presentation and pushed back on 2 points where the compromise had softened something that shouldn't have been softened, and Wills accepted both revisions without resistance, which told Nora she'd been right about Wills from the first phone call. This was someone who actually wanted the right answer, rather than the manageable answer. At the end of the meeting, Wills looked at her. "I need your answer," she said. Nora looked around the table. Vasquez, who'd filed a report 6 weeks ago that had been buried, and then filed another one that hadn't been, and who had stood in an ER for 18 hours straight because there was no one else. Bev, who had called her on a Sunday night from a cautious distance and described what was happening in careful words because she wasn't sure who was listening. The 2 returning nurses, who'd come back to a place that had failed them because the failure was being addressed rather than papered over. She thought about this question Wills had asked in the first meeting, what this hospital needs to be. It was a different question than she'd been asked at most places she'd worked. Most places had a version of what they were and were looking for people to maintain it. Wills was asking what it should become. "I'll take the position," Nora said, "on 2 conditions." Wills waited. "First, the clinical governance structure we just agreed on gets written into my employment contract as a structural requirement, not a policy preference, meaning it can't be reversed by administrative decision alone." "Done," Wills said. "Second, the 11 nurses who left, the ones who left because of how this place was run. I want their applications reviewed for reinstatement before any external posting goes out." Wills looked at her for a moment. "I was already planning that." "Then we're aligned," Nora said. She called Renata that evening. "It's done," Renata said. "The immediate part is done," Nora said. There's a trial. That's months away. "But you're staying." "For now, yes." Renata was quiet for a moment. "Is it what you thought it was going to be when you took the job?" Nora stood at the window of the motel room. She'd need to find an actual apartment now, something with a functioning heater that didn't sound like a man with a wrench, and looked out at the parking lot and the town beyond it, Denton in November going about its business in the gray light. "No," she said. "It's bigger than what I thought it was going to be." "Are you okay with that?" She thought about it honestly. "I think so," she said. "Yeah, I think I am." Renata exhaled. "Call me when you find a real place to live. That motel is making me anxious from 500 miles away." Nora almost laughed. "Yeah, I will." She hung up and stood at the window for a while longer, not thinking about anything in particular, which was itself unusual enough to notice. Gerald Foss was discharged from Mercy Vale on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the night his infusion pump failed silently, in the dark, and didn't alarm, and Nora had come through the door of room 14 already moving. He was walking with a cane he probably wasn't going to need in another month, and his daughter was with him, a woman in her 40s who had the look of someone who'd been frightened for a long time and was only now beginning to believe it was okay to stop. Nora happened to be on the floor. She'd started in her new role 2 weeks prior, and the learning curve of clinical leadership was steeper than she'd anticipated and less steep than she'd feared, which probably meant it was calibrated correctly. She was reviewing a shift handover when she looked up and saw Gerald being walked toward the elevator by his daughter and a discharge nurse. He saw her. He stopped. His daughter looked at him, and then at Nora, trying to read the situation. "That's her," Gerald said. Nora walked over. She wasn't entirely sure what she was going to say. He looked at her for a moment, the way people looked at you when they were trying to put the version of you they'd seen at a crisis moment together with the version standing in front of them now. "I heard what they said on the news," he said, "about what you found, about all of it." "Some of it was accurate," she said. "More than some," he said. He had the careful voice of a man who'd had time to think about what he wanted to say and was still making sure he got it right. "I don't remember much from that night. I remember your voice. You kept talking to me." "It helps," she said. "Staying with someone." It did. He looked at her for another moment. Thank you. It was a simple sentence, and she took it simply, without deflecting. I'm glad you're walking out, she said. His daughter touched his arm, and they moved toward the elevator, and Nora watched them go, and she stood in the hallway of the hospital that had fired her 6 weeks ago, that she now worked in with a contract that embedded clinical governance requirements into its structural architecture, and she let herself feel the weight of it. Not the triumph version of the feeling, not the clean, vindicated hero feeling, because that wasn't what it actually was. It was something more complicated and more real than that. Something closer to, this mattered, and it was hard, and it's not finished, and I'm still here. Books. The trial date was set for the following spring, April, in a federal courtroom in Billings. Holt's bail appeal was denied in December, which meant he spent those months in custody, which was a consequence that his attorney described as unjust, and which Hirsch described in a call to Nora that lasted 3 minutes, as appropriate. 3 of the 9 hospital administrators implicated in Finch's cooperation agreement negotiated plea deals before the trial date. 2 others decided to fight the charges, which extended the overall timeline but didn't change the trajectory. Stuart Finch, Caravant's CEO, entered a cooperation agreement that required full financial disclosure and testimony against all 9 hospital administrators, and the immunity he received in exchange was partial rather than complete. He was barred from the medical device industry for life and faced significant civil liability from the hospitals themselves. Rimrock Capital Partners was dissolved. Its principals faced separate civil fraud charges that were still working their way through the courts when spring came. Marcus Holt pleaded guilty in March, 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, a decision that his defense team had apparently been nudging toward for months, and that Holt had resisted until the cooperation agreements made resistance purely theoretical. The charge reduction that Hirsch had offered was narrow. 1 count of conspiracy was reduced in exchange for a full factual admission, which meant that the public record of what he'd done was complete and specific, and not subject to the interpretive gaps that trials sometimes left. He was sentenced in June. 11 years in federal prison, plus restitution to the 9 affected hospitals that would take the rest of his adult life to pay. Nora wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. She was in Mercy Vale's cardiac recovery ward, 3 floors up and 60 miles away, doing her morning rounds. Bev texted her when the sentence came down. Just the number, no commentary, which was a kind of eloquence. She read the text between rooms, standing in the hallway for a moment, and then put her phone in her pocket and went into the next room to check on her patient. The thing nobody tells you about winning is that it doesn't feel like what you expected. The movies have a version of it that involves a specific moment. A door closing, a gavel coming down, a face in a crowd that sees you finally. And that moment carries all the weight. Real life distributes the weight differently. It spreads it out across weeks and months and small, unremarkable moments. And the weight you're carrying gradually becomes less heavy. Not because the load decreases, but because you get stronger from carrying it, and one day you realize you're not bracing for impact anymore. Nora was in her apartment. She'd found one in December, on the 2nd floor of a building 3 blocks from Marta's diner with a functioning heater and windows that faced east so she got the morning light. When she realized this on a Thursday in June, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going warm rather than cold because she'd had time to drink it before it lost heat, which meant she wasn't running anymore. Her service record was public now. Not broadly. It wasn't news because the trial coverage had focused on Holt and the procurement scheme, and the clinical backstory had been absorbed into that larger narrative without Nora's name becoming its own separate headline, which was what she'd quietly hoped for. But it existed in the public record, and people who looked for it found it, and the occasional nurse or physician who joined the staff and looked her up and then came to talk to her about it. Those conversations happened, and she was getting better at having them. What she'd been, what she'd done, in those years that she'd kept separate, it wasn't separate anymore. She'd been afraid that would feel like a loss of something. It turned out to feel more like the end of a performance that had been tiring to maintain. She still wasn't smooth about it. She still didn't have a tidy version of the story that she could deliver to people who asked. She'd say, I was a combat medic. I worked in classified contexts for 7 years. I've seen a lot of people die in circumstances that didn't have to result in death. And then she'd usually say, that's why the equipment failure mattered to me, not as a complete explanation, but as the true one. Bochach. The governance structure she'd written into her contract changed things at Mercy Vale in the way that structural changes change things, slowly and then suddenly, like a dam filling. For the first 6 months, it was mostly bureaucratic, meetings and documentation, and the difficult work of rebuilding professional trust in an institution that had spent years teaching its staff not to report things. The nurses who came back were carrying what they'd been through, and the ones who came fresh were learning alongside institutions that were still figuring out their own new shape. Vasquez stayed. He'd been offered positions at larger facilities twice and turned them both down, which Nora understood and respected without entirely understanding it. And one day she asked him directly, and he said, "Because someone has to stay and make it work." And she recognized the sentence because she'd said something like it herself, in different words, on a different continent, a long time ago. Bev was made charge nurse of the cardiac recovery ward with a title that matched the authority she'd been exercising informally for years, which was a correction the institution was overdue in making. Of the 11 nurses who'd left, 7 came back. 3 had moved their lives elsewhere in ways that weren't reversible. 1 declined for reasons she didn't share, which was her right. The Caravant pumps were replaced with equipment that went through a new procurement process, one that required clinical sign-off at 2 levels, created a financial transparency requirement that prevented the kind of undisclosed relationship that had existed between Holt and Rimrock, and included a mandatory 6-month incident reporting review. The process was slower and more expensive than the old one. It was also harder to corrupt. Gerald Foss came back to the hospital twice in the months after his discharge, once for a follow-up cardiology appointment, once with his daughter for a tour she'd apparently organized for reasons she hadn't fully explained to him in advance. On that second visit, his daughter asked to meet Nora, and they stood in the hallway near the nurses' station for a few minutes, and she said, "He doesn't know how close it was, does he?" It wasn't quite a question. "He knows he was sick," Nora said. "He doesn't know about the alarm." "No." The woman looked at her. "Should he?" Nora thought about this honestly. "I don't think it would help him," she said. "What matters is that it won't happen again." The woman stood with this for a moment and then nodded, with the specific gravity of someone accepting an answer they hadn't expected to find satisfying but did. The thing about being underestimated, the thing nobody says plainly because it's uncomfortable in its accuracy, is that it's not just something that happens to you. It's also something you can accidentally do to yourself. You can build a life that's calibrated to what other people have decided you are, and you can live in that calibration for long enough that you stop feeling the constraint of it, and then something happens that requires you to be more than the calibrated version. And you have a choice. Nora had made her choice in the parking lot of Mercy Vale General at 7 a.m. on a gray October morning, standing next to her car with the documentation she'd collected in an email draft and a number in her phone she hadn't dialed in 2 years. She hadn't known it was the choice that mattered most. She'd just known it was the only honest one. That was how most things worked in her experience. The decisive moments didn't announce themselves. They looked like ordinary moments with a slightly harder edge, and the difference between the people who changed things and the people who didn't was not heroism or special capacity or a moment of sudden inspiration. It was just the willingness to keep moving in the direction of what was true when moving was harder than staying still. She'd spent years learning to work in conditions where staying still meant someone died. She'd carried that forward through every ward and every shift and every place she'd worked where something wasn't right and someone needed to hear it. It was unglamorous and frequently exhausting, and it didn't always work. And the times it didn't work stayed with her in the specific way that failures stayed with people who took their work seriously. But sometimes it worked. Sometimes a heartbeat reorganized itself one beat at a time into something that held. On a Friday afternoon in late September, a year and 3 weeks after she'd gotten off a bus in Denton with a duffel bag and a gas station coffee, Nora was walking out of Mercy Vale at the end of a 10-hour shift when she stopped on the sidewalk outside the entrance and stood for a moment in the early autumn air. The parking lot had been repaved over the summer. The exterior lights had been replaced, all of them, consistently, the right wattage. The sign on the door about visiting hours had been updated twice since she'd first noticed it, each time getting clearer. Small things. The kind of small things that added up to a larger picture. She stood on the new pavement in the clean light and thought about what she would tell someone if someone asked her what the last year had cost and what it had returned. She'd thought about this in fragments over the months, never quite finishing the thought, always moving on to the next thing before she could put it together into something complete. She thought it through now, standing in the parking lot with her jacket unzipped in the last of the September warmth. The cost was real and specific. The isolation of those weeks in the motel, the legal letter designed to make her feel exposed. The calculated decision to fire her in the hope that she'd go quietly. Being walked out of places you'd worked, being made to feel that your concerns were the problem, rather than the conditions that created them, that landed. It landed differently for different people, and the way it landed was usually proportional to how many times it had happened before. She was not the first nurse who'd been shown the door for raising an inconvenient truth. She would not be the last. But here was the thing she'd understood more clearly in the months since everything broke open. The people who built systems of harm, the Holts of the world, the people who made the decision and signed the contract and buried the report, they were counting on silence. They were counting on it the way you counted on a structural assumption, something so reliably present that you didn't question it anymore. The silence of people who were tired or afraid, or who had learned through experience that raising something got you removed rather than heard. The silence of people who'd decided the system was too large and too protected to push against. What they didn't account for was the one person who'd been trained in situations where silence meant someone died, and who'd decided, standing in a parking lot at 7 a.m. with cold hands and a 62-page file, that she wasn't going to be silent one more time. It wasn't a heroic decision. It was a tired one, made by a person who was imperfect and uncertain and carrying more history than she generally talked about, in a situation she hadn't chosen and couldn't fully control. But it was honest, and honest was enough. She zipped up her jacket, picked up her bag, and walked to her car. The drive home took 8 minutes. The apartment smelled like the coffee she'd left in the carafe that morning, and the small plant she'd put on the windowsill in August that was, against reasonable expectation, still alive. She put down her bag and poured the old coffee out, and made new, and stood in her kitchen while the machine ran, and outside the eastern windows the late September light was doing what late September light did, leaning gold and a little melancholy, the specific quality of light that said something was ending and something else was about to begin. She thought about the cardiac ward on the 4th floor where her patients were, right now being handed off from her shift to the next. She thought about the governance committee meeting on Tuesday where they were going to review the incident reporting data from the last quarter and what that data was going to show, and what she was going to argue for changing based on it. She thought about the 2 nurses who'd put in applications last week, one external and one returning, and the conversations she needed to have with both of them. She thought about all of it without dread, which was new, not without weight. The work had weight, always would, but without the braced for impact quality that had been her default register for as long as she could clearly remember. The coffee finished. She poured a cup and went to the window and looked out at Denton in the early evening, at the hardware store and the pharmacy, and Marta's diner and the ordinary streets of a small city that was going about its business, and somewhere across town, the hospital with its new lights and its new pavement and its clinical governance structure and its returned staff, running tonight on adequate staffing and functional equipment, taking care of people who were sick and scared and needed someone to stay with them. She drank her coffee. She was, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she meant to be. The woman they called a problem was the only one who understood the whole of it. The nurse they silenced was the one who kept talking. And the person they fired, quietly, efficiently, confident she'd go away, was the reason 12 people walked out of a hospital that should have failed them. Sometimes the most dangerous thing an institution can do is underestimate a quiet person with a long memory and nowhere left to be afraid.